Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the World Blitz Championship being held in Samarkand in the great country of Uzbekistan. Now, Magnus Carlsen won the rapid event yesterday. Coming into the Blitz, he's trying to defend his title once again, but with such a strong field featuring many top players, including Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia, the runner-up last year in the World Championship match, Daniil Dubov, Vladislav Artemiev, Hans Niemann, Fabiano Caruana, and many others. Will he be up to the task? Now, the format is such that there are 21 games played over 2 days, with 12 games being played today and 9 games being played tomorrow, with a time control of 3 minutes plus 2 seconds per move. So with all these games, so many games to take a look at, we're going to pick out a few that we have highlighted and let's see how they go. So first game we're taking a look at is the game between Hans Niemann from America and Anish Giri from the Netherlands. Now, for Anish Giri, he's in a very unique situation because it seemed like all hope was lost when Gukesh won the tournament in India last week, I should say, in order to surpass him in the FIDE circuit. But if Anish Giri can win the World Blitz Chess Championship, not only will he get a world title, but he will also qualify for the candidates by overtaking Gukesh once again. So the game starts out with knight f3 from Hans. We get Anish playing d5, and now the move b3 being played. After c5, we get e3 here. Now, an interesting opening choice by Hans. He's clearly paying homage to one of his favorite players. That, of course, would be Hikaru Nakamura, who's played the setup with knight f3, e3, and b3 many times, both online and over the board. Now, one of the drawbacks of playing this opening is that Hikaru actually played against Anish Giri in one of the recent Chess Champions Tour events, and Anish clearly was prepared for this setup. So we get knight to f6, bishop b2. Now let's move g6 is played, and here Hans plays c4. Now, in many events that I've played, I've actually played this line with bishop f6 takes and c3 followed by d4, but the computer actually does not like this position for white. It thinks that black is better. So Hans decides to play c4. We get the move d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and now we have the move bishop g7 being played. Hans decides to castle. We get knight to c6. Now we have d4. We get c takes d4, knight takes d4 being played, takes, castles, knight c3, and Anish plays the move queen a5. Now, one thing that's very important, as I've stressed in many of my recent videos, is the difference between classical chess and rapid chess, as well as blitz chess. Now, in this case, specifically blitz, this move queen a5 is not a very good move by Anish, but it poses white a lot of questions. The first big question is, if white plays a move like h3 and black goes to e5, your bishop here is stuck in the middle of the board. You have no squares to retreat the bishop to, queen guards a pawn on e5, and white will lose the game. So why do I say this move is bad? Now, this move is bad because if white were to use his time, you can play a move like a3 here, and after e5 is played, you can now go b4, queen c7, bishop to c5 here, and let's say black plays rook d8. Now you have this nice in-between move, knight to b5, hitting the queen on c7 while your queen is under attack. If you were to move your queen to say b3, for example, now black might have b6 trying to trap the bishop on c5. But again, in a blitz game where you don't have a lot of time to think, it's very hard to come up with the best moves on the fly, and Hans does not find the best move. He plays this move knight b5. Now again, nothing wrong with this move per se, but this is the big issue when you don't have even 1 minute to think on a single move, because here you're trying to find moves to go quickly in the opening, but it's very hard to do a deep calculation, because if you spend all this time and you make a mistake, you will simply lose the game on the clock. So we get knight to b5. Anish plays the move a6. We get bishop c3, queen b6, and now this move knight d4 is played by Hans. Now, when I was doing my live coverage on Kick, I was actually surprised by this knight d4 move. I expected Hans to play bishop d4 with the idea that after queen a5, bishop c3, the game would end in a draw. Now, of course, Anish is a player who's known to draw many games, and so when we saw knight d4 from Hans, I was very surprised because after this move bishop g4, now black gets to finish his development very quickly. The knight's dropping to e4 in the center, and it feels like if anybody's better, it can only be black. So we have bishop e2 from Hans, rook c8 played by Anish. We get bishop back to b2, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, and now the move rook fd8 is played. Now black here is very slightly better because you have the rooks on the 2 open files. You can always move your knight to e4, but most importantly, you can kick this knight out of the center with this move pawn to e5. So we get rook ac1, knight e4 is played. We have h3 being played, a simple move by Hans to create some lift for the king on h2 so that there are no ice skaters. After h3, we get queen to a5. Hans plays bishop a1 to guard the pawn on a2. Anish plays queen to a3, and now we have this move rook c2. After rook c2, we get knight to d6, and now we have this move bishop b2. Rook takes rook, bishop takes queen is played, rook takes queen, knight takes rook, and at this point it looks like Hans should be able to draw the game very easily here. We're in an endgame, even material, no big weaknesses, but there is one slight problem, which is that black has control of the d file and he can try to create the classic kebab with rook to d2. So we get knight to e4, intending to play rook d2 to attack both the knight on e2 as well as the pawn on a2. Hans plays rook c1 here. Now this is not really a mistake per se, but bishop to b4 would have been slightly better to stop rook to d2, followed by potentially pawn to f3, kicking the knight out of the center of the board. So we get rook c1. Now bishop f6 played by Anish to guard the pawn, not rook d2 by the way, because then after rook c8 check, bishop f8, bishop takes e7. White will lose the knight on e2, but in return white will get this bishop on f8 and be up an extra pawn here, because as we can see from the count, white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, an extra pawn for white. So Anish plays bishop to f6 here, guarding the pawn on e7. Bishop b4 played by Hans, stopping rook to d2 here. We get rook to d7, and now this move f3 is played. Now at this point it feels like maybe Hans can even be a little bit better if he can build a nice big chain of pawns here with the pawns from g2 to f3 to e4. We have knight g5, and now Hans plays knight to f4. Now to me, I'm a little bit surprised by this move. I kind of felt like e4 or potentially king to f2 both made a little bit more sense, but I think for Hans, he thought that when he went knight to f4 he could just go e4 and knight d5 in the next couple of moves. And also it feels a little bit like some hopium where he's trying to trap this knight on g5. Say black plays a move like b5, now you can maybe go h4, and after knight to e6 takes. It's not a big advantage for white after bishop e1, but black has some serious weaknesses here with all of these pawns being under attack in the next couple of moves. So after knight to f4, now we have the move bishop e5 being played by Anish. We get king to f2, h5 is played, we get knight to e2, and now knight e6 is played. Of course, black does not want to allow the fork with f4 after say h4 f4, as black will lose a piece. You can check, but after king to f3, bishop covers the d2 square, and both of these pieces are under attack. So we get knight to e6. Hans plays f4, we get bishop c7, g4 takes, f6 is played. At this point we're all expecting the game to end in a draw. We have a4 being played, king f7, king f3, bishop b6, and now a5, bishop to a7, and this move rook c3. Now one thing that Hans has done here, which is very wrong, is he's actually created a serious weakness by putting this pawn on the same color as the dark square bishop. When we look at this position, both sides have a lot of pawns on the light squares relative to having these two bishops. But after a5, bishop a7, rook c3, and knight d8, now Anish intends to go knight c6, try to reroute the bishop, and he intends to win the pawn on a5. We get the move bishop c5 being played here by Hans, which is a mistake. So after takes, and knight c6, white will always have this permanent weakness with this pawn on a5. You cannot go b4 because the knight captures. You cannot go knight d4 because after knight d4 takes, black once again has an extra pawn. So as such, now the rook is glued to the pawn, and for that reason black is much better since he can now bring the rook into play and try to win the game. So here we have knight c3 being played. After knight to c3, we get the move rook to d2, and now Hans plays knight to d5. After knight to d5, we have this move rook b2 being played, going after the pawn on b3, and now we have knight c7. Now when Hans goes knight c7, what he's trying to do is give up this pawn on b3 in return for this pawn on a6, and he's hoping to be able to draw the game. So we get rook b3, knight takes a6, but now after rook to a3, Hans is in a lot of trouble. Now the computer says that knight d4 is actually winning, because when white moves the king to, let's just say, e4, after knight to e6, both the rook and the knight are under attack here, and white will lose material. Now probably the players are very low on time here, so Anish goes rook to a3 instead. We get knight c7, and after rook takes a5, while white is only a little bit worse here, black has one extra pawn. And one general rule that I would say about all endgames, whether it's classical chess, rapid, or blitz, is the one endgame that is the least drawish when there's an imbalance are knight and pawn endgames. For that reason, Hans plays rook c1, we get rook to a4, knight to d5 is played, we have rook to a3, rook to b1, and now this move knight d4 is played. We get king f2, rook to b3, an excellent move from Anish trying to trade the rooks. Hans goes rook to c1 here, which I think is a mistake. Probably he should have played rook to h1, trying to activate the rook with rook to h7, but alas, we get rook c1. After rook c1, rook to b2 check is played, and now things are really starting to fall apart because Hans would love to go king g3, but after knight to e2, the king and the rook get forked, and white will lose the game. So Hans goes king to f1, Now we get knight to c2, and with this king so passive on the back rank, it's very hard for white to play. Additionally, his pawn at e3 is under some serious pressure here in the next couple of moves. Hans goes f5 here, pretty much the only move, by the way, because if you play a move like, let's just say king g1, for example, after e6 attacking the knight, knight moves, knight takes pawn. Now black has 2 extra pawns in the endgame, and it's completely hopeless at the GM level. And if white plays this move king to e2, black can create the classic fossil with knight to b4, checking the king and winning this knight on d5 after king f3, knight takes knight. So Hans goes f5 trying to stop e6. Anish trades the pawns, and now he goes e6. After e6, we get the trade of pawns, knight to f4, and now this move king f5. And at this point, Hans is going to probably lose his pawn on e3 here. It's super weak. King is cut off on the back rank here. You can't really bring it up without walking into discoveries, and so it's really dire. We get king to e2 from Hans. Anish goes king to e4. We get king d2, knight takes pawn, king c3, and now rook b6 is played. We have knight to h5, rook c6, king d2, and Anish decides to trade the rooks. Now again, what did I say earlier? Knight and pawn endgames are the trickiest endgame to play, and here black has 2 extra pawns, but on top of having 2 extra pawns, we have the classic wide peepo scenario where the pawns are split very wide. So we get knight to d5, king d2, Anish plays b5, knight g3, king e5, knight e2, and now f5 is played. This knight here on d5 dominates the white horse. The knight can't go anywhere to attack the pawns. We have king d3 being played by Hans, and now after knight to f4 check, forking the king and the knight, Hans has no choice here. He can trade the knights, but this position is very simply winning, as black will get a queen. And if you don't trade the knights, you go here, same thing, I trade, and eventually the king can't stop both pawns, as one of these pawns will get through to the end of the board, and black will win. So Anish wins this game, a very nice game from him, pretty much from start to finish. There were inaccuracies by both sides, but he does get the win when all is said and done. So a big win for Anish, and now we're going to move on to the next game. Now this next game we're going to be taking a look at is a game that is played between 2 of the actual co-leaders in the event, Magnus Carlsen and Nihal Sarin. Now Magnus needs no introduction. We've spoken about him a lot. He recently won the World Rapid Championship. He's trying to go back-to-back and win the Blitz as well, but Nihal is someone we have not spoken about. Now, out of all the junior players I've seen in recent times, Nihal Sarin reminds me the most of myself. So you're probably wondering, what does that mean? Now, when I say that Nihal reminds me the most of myself, prior to breaking through in classical chess for probably at least 5 to 6 years, I was around 2650 to 2660 FIDE rated, maybe up even into the 2670s. I wasn't breaking through 2700, but I was a dominant force in online blitz. Now for Nihal, it's very similar. He's been stuck in this 2670 to 2680, 2690 range for seemingly the last 2 years. But in terms of online blitz, which he plays a lot, he is a monster. He has a very high rating, usually over 3200. Someone who's performed great in blitz but struggled in classical. So out of all the juniors I've seen in recent times, he reminds me the most of myself, and he is one of my dark horses for somebody who I think could win the blitz event. So Magnus starts with e4 here. We get c5 from Nihal, knight to f3. We have this move d6 being played. We now get d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6, and Magnus plays this rook g1 line. Now Magnus played this quite recently against Alireza Firouzja, who recently qualified for the candidates in one of the online events. It looks like a very strange move here, but white has a simple idea of playing g4 and g5 to expand and push p on the king side as quickly as possible. The drawback, of course, is that when you move the rook to g1, you no longer can castle the king over to the king side because you've moved the rook, so you're really only intending to castle to the queen side. So we get knight c6. Magnus goes g4 here. We get g6 being played. Now perhaps black can take on d4 and take this pawn on g4, but it's very hard to judge, especially in a blitz game, because after bishop e2, let's say you go knight f6, for example, white plays bishop g5, white's going to castle, you have the open g file, you can push in the center of the board, and black has 1 2 3 4 5 6 pieces that are underdeveloped here, whereas white has finished his development very quickly. And in a blitz game specifically, it's going to be borderline impossible to defend this. In a classical game, maybe you could, but in a blitz game, there's pretty much zero chance. So here, instead of going for the pawn, Nihal decides he is not going to be greedy, because being greedy is bad. We get g6 played with the intention of fianchettoing the bishop to g7, g5, knight to h5. And now you're probably thinking, wait, Nihal's put his knight on the rim. This knight on the rim, you always say knight on the rim is dim. What is he doing? But the idea for Nihal is that he intends to try to bring the knight back towards the center of the board via this f4 square down the road. So we have bishop to e3, Bishop g7 is played. We now get the move bishop to e2, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, bishops come off. We have this move e5, queen b4, and now Nihal plays the move knight to f4. He has this nice bastion here with the pawn supporting the knight, and it looks like maybe it's okay. However, there is a big drawback. After Magnus castles, now this pawn on d6 is super weak, and if white can win this pawn on d6 or the pawn on b7 here, white will probably have very good winning chances. So Nihal plays bishop e6, and now Magnus plays this move bishop g4, which is simply a blunder. In this position, what Magnus should have played was the move rook takes d6, because after queen to e7, the computer says in this line with queen c5 attacking the pawn, white is simply much better here. Now, in a blitz game, you can't really be very critical because players don't have a lot of time. You have to play a lot of intuition, and Magnus probably thought here he would have to play something like rook b6, where after takes, and castles, even though white has an extra pawn here on c2, this knight on f4 with the pawn on e5 actually gives black the better chances here in this endgame. So Magnus decides to play bishop g4, and now Nihal uses a lot of time here, but comes up with the right move, which is to take this pawn on g5. Now, on first glance, this looks insane because there's bishop takes e6, your queen is under attack. However, after bishop takes bishop, there's a very nice move, knight to d3, creating the fossil as well as a double check here with knight to d3 hitting the king. Magnus goes king b1, knight takes queen is played, rook takes queen, he takes the bishop, rook takes pawn, and now castles is played here by Nihal, and this is an excellent move and the only move in fact to not be worse. Now the reason this move is so good is because if you were to play a move like king e7 after rook b6, the pawns in the center are still very weak, and when you go knight c6 takes and king d6 for example after rook g3, white will bring the rook to the center, white has an extra pawn, and white should win the game. So when black decides to castle here, it does two things. First of all, king is out of the center, no checks in the center of the board, but also now your rook on f8 is in prime position to capture the pawns on the second rank and create the classic kebab. So Magnus goes rook g2, we get rook a d8, rook b6 played here. Obviously white does not want to trade these rooks on d8, because if you trade and go king c1, black can simply go rook c8, maybe rook f8 even, and you have this very passive rook on g2. Pawns on e6 and e5 are actually very well placed. Can't jump with the knight to the center of the board, black can bring the knight back, and if anybody is better here, it probably is black. So we get rook b6 being played. Now knight c6 from Nihal, we get takes, rook to d2, excellent move, pressuring the pawns on the second rank here and creating the kebab. We have rook b6 from Magnus, Nihal plays knight d4, going after the pawn on c2. We get rook takes a6, rook takes c2, which is apparently a mistake, by the way. Computer says black should play rook b8 here to stop rook b6, followed by rook c2, and then maybe black is even a little bit better in this position because of these serious weaknesses around the white king. These pawns in particular cannot really defend the king. Instead, we get rook takes c2. Now Magnus plays rook b6, stopping this idea of rook to b8 to win the pawn on b2, and it looks like Magnus might even have chances to win. So we have rook a8 from Nihal, a4 played by Magnus, king to f7, and now we have rook b7 being played by Magnus, king f6, and this move rook takes h7. Now rook takes h7 is a fairly serious mistake here. Computer says after rook to b4, white is better, and the reason is that after rook to d2, now you can probably play this move knight to b, or actually sorry, not knight to b5 in this position. You can go h4, h5, and now I think after rook to g1 followed by knight b5, white should be better, although maybe even this isn't so clear according to the computer. Now you're probably thinking, well, okay, the computer says white is much better here, like what's the reasoning for that? But in a human game, it's much harder to play this position, and the players are getting kind of low on time here, and when you get low on time, you don't really have the time, or you're not in a situation where you can use a lot of time and try to figure out what the best plan is here. And for Magnus, it's very difficult because the king is a little bit weak here. The rook on g2 is stuck guarding these two pawns. Can't really move the knight to rook d1. You don't really want to move the rook to like c4, because now after rook b8, suddenly black has great chances to win once again, and for that reason Magnus decides to go for rook takes h7. So we get rook to b8, trying to win the pawn on b2, and now we have this move knight to b5 being played by Magnus Carlsen. Nihal plays rook to e2, and there's massive pressure on the second rank. Now here Magnus plays the move rook h6, we get knight takes knight, rook takes pawn, king f7, check, king g7, and now Magnus Carlsen forces a draw with this check. Keeps checking with the rooks on the sixth rank here. Does rook h6, you can just check infinity. King and rook will just keep going back and forth, and Magnus of course does not want to take the knight, because after rook takes pawn, now black is going to create his own double stack on the second rank as well. Now white of course could still force a draw, but that's the reason the game does not continue. So after king to h7, the game ends in a draw and both players are tied for the lead. Now Magnus Carlsen and Nihal Sarin are on 9 points currently out of 12, along with a big slew of other players, including 2 specific players that I'm going to mention. We have Jan Nepomniachtchi and Danil Dubov, both from Russia, who are competing. They have 9 points out of 12, and currently they are tied for lead, but there is potentially a big drama in play. Now, you probably wonder, what am I talking about when I refer to a big drama? So let's take a look at a game that's played, I believe this was in the 11th round, between Danil Dubov with the white pieces and Jan Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. In this game, we get knight f3 from Dubov, knight to f6, we get knight to d4, knight to d5. Now we have knight b3, knight b6, knight c3, knight c6, knight e4, knight e5, knight g5, knight g4, knight f3, knight f6, knight g1, knight g8, knight c5, knight c4, knight a4, knight a5, knight c3, knight c6, knight b1, knight b8, and the players agree to a draw. So both of these players have moved the knights all over the board. They've done something which you could say is close to what we call the Knights tour, of moving the knights all around the board, putting them on their original square, and the game ends in a draw on move 12. Now, there are many commentators who are saying this was a prearranged draw. The players had agreed to draw before the game. It's very clear this is not a real game, and they should be getting 0 points for this result. Now, we don't know what the outcome is going to be from this game. A lot of people have been complaining. Jan Ludwig Hammer, for example, on Twitter/X was saying that the players should never take such risks. They're risking their careers, their reputations, and they should both be forfeited, or actually, I don't know if he said forfeited or disqualified, but that they could be forfeited or disqualified from the event. Now, in my opinion, I don't think anything is going to happen, for the simple reason that if you choose to give both players a 0 and or disqualify them from the event, it's going to set a precedent that going forward will be very difficult to patrol in terms of whether games are prearranged, whether players just made a repetition of the board, what exactly was going on. Now, the most obvious example of a repetition is in the Berlin defense, a line that many people have played, including myself, where black takes. You got this end game here with takes, d6, takes, check, back and forth, and the game ends in a draw. Now, if you were to say that both players should get 0 points for this, it's going to be a problem, because going forward, there are many games that have ended with this repetition where there was no agreement before the game. The game simply was played with this variation, and it ended in a draw, including many games that I myself have played against Wesley So. And in that case, what do you do? Because obviously it wasn't prearranged, but then you sort of open the door for people to say that any repetition in the opening could have been match fixing, could have been prearranged, or whatnot. So players do make this repetition. The game ends in a draw. They are amongst that group of 8 people who are tied for the lead with 9 points out of 12. That group does include Magnus, Nihal Sarin, Danil Dubov, Jan Nepomniachtchi, Vladislav Artemiev, I believe Arjun Erigaisi, Alexander Ryazantsev, and I think Maxim Vachilegrov is also on 9 points, if I'm not mistaken. So we have a big slew of players, 8 players tied for the lead after 12 rounds. There are 9 more rounds of Blitz tomorrow. It's going to be very, very exciting. We'll see if Magnus can put it together and win, but there are many formidable players who are going to be chasing him and or potentially trying to win their first World Chess Championship. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of a couple of the select games from the first day of the World Blitz Chess Championship in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. If you guys like my channel or you haven't had the chance to subscribe it, make sure to smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back tomorrow with another recap once we have crowned a winner in the World Blitz Chess Championship. See you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.